Trump 2.0. And in this session, we'll be asking how to cover something where the truth is often stranger than fiction. And how can humor, satire, comedy be a tool to make sense of the reality around us? And already on stage, so I don't need to clap them up, but let's give a big hand to Susan Morrison, New Yorker editor and author, and journalist Shazna Nessa.
Thank you so much. I just want to expand the intro of Susan. So Susan is the articles editor at the New Yorker magazine, and she just wrote a book, which will be the first slide, called Lorne. It's a best-selling, instant bestseller. Lorne, the man who invented Saturday Night Live. And so Susan's going to tell us a little bit about the book and what Saturday Night Live is, for those of you who are not familiar with it. And I just also want to say that she was the original founder of Spy, one of the original founders of Spy magazine, which we'll also talk about later, which was really groundbreaking
way back in the 1980s.
So let's talk about Lorne, Susan.
Well, this SNL has been around for 50 years. I started this book about 10 years ago, and I wanted to write it because I realized, watching the 40th anniversary special, how uncanny it was that one guy, particularly a Canadian, had so much power over what makes Americans laugh for 40 years. And for our purposes today, I thought it would be worth explaining to you the origin of that show, which you might not know about. When Lorne started the show 50 years ago, there really wasn't anything on television where you could, criticize the government. There had been the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour on in the 60s, but that was yanked off the air when Richard Nixon called the head of CBS and said, "I don't want you criticizing my war on television." Now, Lorne had this idea that, his was the first generation to grow up on television, and he really wanted to kind of put television under the microscope. He also wanted to put his generation's concerns, sex and drugs and rock and roll, on TV. And they had just been through Watergate, they had just been through the Vietnam War. There really was no place on TV to deal with these things and to make fun of them and to talk about them in the vernacular language that young people used. So the reason he got away with it and the Smothers Brothers did not is because it was on at 11:30 p.m. when all the grown-ups who ran the networks were asleep. And that is really the key to why this has lasted as long as it has. As he put it, when they started the show, it was almost like a vacant lot on the edge of town. Now we're all used to watching the show, in YouTube clips on our phone. Amy Poehler told me of SNL. She said, "SNL, that's the show my parents used to watch while they were having sex, and now I watch on my computer in the middle of my workday."
Let's watch some of these clips, some of these YouTube clips. We have 3 clips of how Trump has been covered by SNL. Let's go with the first one.
As you know, my lying impeachment inquiry continues. And what is it really, folks?
A witch hunt!
And there was absolutely no collusion. No, the new one. There was no
quid pro quo.
That's right. No quid pro code. These Democrats, led by Adam Shifty Shift, he's a real shithead. It's a deep state conspiracy, and tonight I'd like to bring up some of my loyal followers to explain what's really happening in this country. First up, we have Christine from Las Cruces.
Yes, I am, and I'm proud that you asked me up here.
I think you got a couple of typos on that shirt.
Nope, this was taken verbatim from one of your tweets, therefore it's correct. The words need to change because you said so, sir.
Okay, we'll explain to everyone what the Dems are doing.
So from the beginning, Lorne's idea was that the show would parody all politicians, speak truth to power no matter what party was in office. We made fun of Jimmy Carter, they made fun of the Clintons, and Ronald Reagan and Obama. But Trump, of course, is really the big Megillah. And over the years, a number of different actors have portrayed him. This is Alec Baldwin, who really, it was a sensation when he did Trump during his first term. He told me that people would just stop him on the street regularly and, thank him for his, service to the nation. But it's interesting, Baldwin, I think, played Trump sort of the way we thought of him back then, as this sort of unstable bully. He thought that, he watched a lot of tape of Trump, thought that he had all the classic speech patterns of a manic depressive. And you'll see in this next clip, the characterization kind of changes over time as we have come to view Trump. He's always been a comic, a kind of an opera buffa figure in certain ways. Although I think that, especially with what's been going on in LA and New York in the past week, it's veering ever closer to tragedy. So, the characterization has to be tweaked. So let's look at the next one.
It's me, your favorite president, and perhaps your next pope. Conclave. Well, it's been 100 years since I became president. Excuse me. Days, wow. Feels longer, but people are saying that what I've done so far has single-handedly helped win people elections, mostly in Canada. I've also signed 147 executive orders, everything from banning paper straws to defunding PBS. I understand
So this is James Austin Johnson, a young comedian who's been doing Trump for the last few seasons. And I kind of like his Trump better. I think he really gets the banality of, what Trump really is, he's like a used car salesman. It's Trump as pitchman. I think his concerns, we all know he's more concerned with enriching himself and his family than he is with anything having to do with...
It's me, your favorite president, and perhaps your next pope.
That's just like him, isn't it? Interrupting me.
Can I ask you a question? Yes. As I understand, Trump watches SNL religiously. Could you tell us a little bit about what you know about his feedback to how he's been represented?
Well, one of the reasons that SNL is sort of such an effective way to get at Trump is that, he's incredibly vain. He is himself a creature of show business, extremely thin-skinned. During his first term, and even now, you had the sense that he was paying more attention to this comedy show than to, ISIS, gun violence, the Middle East. He would routinely tweet these insane all-cap invectives toward Lorne Michaels and the show, calling for FCC investigations, saying that there was collusion with the Democratic Party. And, you have to think about sort of what the role and function of satire is in a society. I think in Europe, there's a little bit more of a tradition of satire as a political tool that could really make changes. I feel like in America, we see it more as a sort of a pressure release valve, a way we can all watch this thing together and laugh at this idiot and perhaps create some of that bonding dopamine that you get if you're at a rally. But it does get under his skin so much. Some of the writers of the show tell me that sometimes it feels like bear baiting. They write this stuff, he goes completely crazy. Although there's a downside. One young writer told me sometimes he worries that something he writes is going to cause Trump to blow up the world, which would not be so funny.
Maybe we can go to the third clip, which is Trump himself.
Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump.
It's wonderful to be here. I will tell you, this is going to be something special. Many of the greats have hosted, as you know, this show, like me, in 2004. A lot of people are saying, Donald, you're the most amazing guy. You're brilliant, you're handsome, you're rich, you have everything going. The world is waiting for you to be president. So why are you hosting Saturday Night Live? Why? And the answer is, I have really nothing better to do.
Now, we've gone back in time a few years here. When Trump hosted the show while he was running for office, it was enormously controversial. And Lorne Michaels was in the hot seat and is still kind of apologizing for it to some extent these days. You know, he was also going to have Hillary Clinton on that season. She pulled out at the last minute. You know, there's always an effort to have balance, to have both sides. But a lot of the younger people on the staff were horrified that Trump was hosting the show. You know, they felt that we're helping normalize this guy. And, you know, there's something to be said for that. I mean, especially because, as I said before, this guy is a creature of show business. You know, he was known to the electorate as the star of The Apprentice. He was someone who had just logged his, 10,000 hours on television, to use Malcolm Gladwell's phrase. But they tried really hard, the writers who hated Trump. I mean, everyone on the show thought that he was an imbecile, and they thought what they were going to be showing people is sort of what a miscreant he was. And nobody at that point thought he was going to get elected. They thought he was like a big joke, a big punchline. But they did manage to, Trump was so clueless. He showed up that week for the show without anyone, any media handlers, anyone to vet the material. He did a sketch. He let them put him in a sketch that showed him being endorsed by porn stars. He just didn't have any discretion about this. But anyway, I just think it's an interesting way to look at what this show is trying to do. And sometimes I think misstepping. They got in similar hot water a few years ago when Elon Musk hosted. I mean, this was before Musk was the chainsaw-wielding weirdo that we've seen in the Oval Office. He was just, the other kind of weirdo. But they both were ratings magnets, and this is a business, and that's what that was about.
Well, I mean, Lorne talks a lot about comedy as entertainment. So how do you make entertainment out of these characters? And and I'm curious also about how comedy and politics has evolved. You hinted at how some of the writers, some of the actors were very uncomfortable, the comedians were uncomfortable playing. How does that affect the show itself?
Yes, well, in recent years, I mean, as I said, from the very beginning, his idea was that you would attack the left, you'd attack the right, whoever was in power, whoever needed razzing, you have to go after them. I think that what's happened in the last 8 or so years is that things feel so stressful. I mean, this is such a calamitous time that especially the younger people on the staff, when I was there one day when Cecily Strong, one of the cast members, objected to portraying Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democratic senator, because she didn't want to be mean to anybody on the left. And, Lorne's response to that would be, well, no, you have to take in the whole picture, and you have to kind of let viewers decide what they think. And you don't want it to start to seem too one-sided. The Daily Show, and there was a show hosted by Samantha Bee. Are any of you guys familiar with those shows? Do you see them on YouTube here or anything? And there's a feeling that those shows were, at least from Lorne Michaels' perspective, were maybe sort of too partisan, that there's no element of surprise when you always know who the target is going to be. There's no sense of there being kind of a fresh angle on things. And Seth Meyers, who has his own talk show, but was the head writer of SNL for years, coined a really interesting term that I love about political humor. And the word is clapter. And what clapter is let's say someone is doing a riff or doing a political joke, and it doesn't elicit a laugh from the audience, but it makes them clap and say, I agree with that, yes, yes, yes. It's sort of a virtue signaling response, sort of pat yourself on the shoulder, on the back for having the correct political opinion. When what a real comedian wants, a real comedy person wants a laugh, not a clap, because a laugh is, it's a spasm, it's an involuntary physical response. And Lorne's idea, and most of the sort of old timers at the show and old timer comedy people think that is the greater value. And what we were just saying, like, I think in this time of terrible terrible political scene that we have at home, just the idea of having this pressure release of this kind of common feeling with the other people laughing together with us in the room, that's maybe what we need more than saying, here, I agree with that sentiment.
For those who aren't as familiar with SNL, it sounds like a lot of you are. It might be worth also explaining the live nature of it and how it is in a studio with a bunch of people who are laughing. You can hear them laughing on television.
Yeah, one of the things that's incredibly unusual about the show is that it is done live. I mean, as I said, a lot of people are watching it the next day on their phones, but it's done live, which is, the only thing done live now is sports, and it is very like like sports doing it. You have people running around, changing their clothes in the aisles, scenery sort of coming in and out of the studio. And the way it plays to that live audience in the room is incredibly important, because that energy is what goes through the airwaves to you at home. If it were done in a studio without anyone in the audience, it would be stale and dead. And so it has been very interesting to see some of this Trump material with live audience. There's a term that the writers and performers at the show use when something chills the audience, and that's something, and that just means something that's like almost too icky, almost too upsetting. I've seen that happen when they do jokes that are sort of about, I don't know, immigration or abortion, or just pushing the bounds of taste. And yeah, no, it's an unusual way to do any kind of entertainment these days with no net.
You said the word taste just then, so I'd love to dig into that a little bit. And what do you know about the audience? What do you know about the SNL audience? And has the audience changed? What is the feedback that the show is getting?
Well, the audience is sort of diehards who write in for tickets. And these days, there's a standby line of people, who camp out on 49th Street, for days at a time to try to get into the show. So it's fans who are going to laugh. But another thing that's unusual about the way the show is done is there's a dress rehearsal at 8:00 done before a live audience. And the way that plays really affects what is, how the final show with a different audience goes on at 11:30. Everyone listens very carefully to how the audience responds to that, and tweaks are made. That's when you hear, in terms of taste, like let's say there's a joke that, I was there once when there was a sketch about this guy who had been arrested for sending pipe bombs to enemies of President Trump, and he was apprehended in a van covered with hate speech graphics and Hillary Clinton's face with a target over it and everything. And when this came out in dress rehearsal, you could just hear the whole audience go, nobody laughed. Everyone just thought, this is unpleasant. And so that didn't make it on the air. There's another thing, it's very important to them that they get real people in the audience. Back in the 80s, when the show was in its first 10 years, it was sort of so hot for a while that they'd get all these showbiz people in the audience. And, you don't want showbiz people in the audience. They're jaded. They're not going to be kind of primed. And I remember Will Ferrell telling me, looking out in the audience one night and seeing in the front row, 10 agents and their dates asleep. It's exactly what you don't want. You want real citizens.
So I want to go back into your career. How did you get to writing this book, which took you 10 years, by the way, which is also another interesting thing, is that as an editor, most of your career, this is the first book you've ever written. So that switch to words. But I also want to go to the next slide and look at Sky magazine. Not Sky, sorry, Spy. Because you've been talking about Trump for quite a long time now.
Yes. So I've been an editor for 40 years. In the 1980s, with a couple of friends of mine who worked at Time magazine, Graydon Carter and Kurt Anderson, we started this magazine called Spy, loosely based on Private Eye, which I'm sure a lot of you see and know. And in the 80s, which was during the Reagan era, the media, it was a terrible time for media. There was plenty of money in the media. Maybe that's why it was a terrible time. But by and large, the media was really worshipful of money and power, especially in New York. New York was full of all these newly rich Wall Street guys and their wives in their poof dresses and their poof hairdos. And I worked at Vanity Fair at the time when we started it, and we were all just so tired of how uncritical the media was. So our idea starting this magazine was that it would be journalistic. We would break news, but we would be irreverent. One of the phrases we used is that we wanted to bite the ankles of the overdog, And as a result, because we were the only game in town doing this, all of our journalist friends at the New York Times and everywhere else would call us with all the stories that they couldn't get into print at their, much more staid publications. So we were on to Trump as early as, in 1986. Our first cover was called a list of the 10 most embarrassing New Yorkers. And Trump was a number one. And I think we christened him the short-fingered vulgarian, because I don't know if you've ever noticed, but he has excessively small hands. And that began, it's what I was talking about before, about his incredibly thin skin. Trump was probably in every issue of Spy. And, we were onto his bankruptcies, all of his various corruption that has been going on, since the 80s. All the people who built Trump Tower and his cheesy casinos, he never paid those people on time if he paid them for all. He was just known in New York as, a nightmare deadbeat. But from the very beginning, again, talk about bear baiting, he would always respond to us. He would sometimes tear a page out of the magazine. And if I might be the only person here who has correspondence with Donald Trump, and I'll tell you, he always writes in a gold Sharpie, which might not surprise you. So we'd get these pages covered in his gold Sharpie scrawl sent back to us. I'm calling my lawyer. One time he sent us an outline of his hand, and he said, I have normal size fingers. So, by the time he was running for president, we just couldn't believe it. This little Donald unhappy at last. This was a cover that we did, I think, covering one of his, spectacular bankruptcies. We thought we were putting him away. We were wrong, but we're all still waiting with bated breath for the time when this cover becomes a reality.
Do you still have the outline of the golden hand?
We have all of this stuff in various people's basements and closets. Now that I'm done with the book, one of my next projects is going to be to try to pull together, the Spy archive, and I think we're going to donate it to NYU. The correspondence that we would get, there was also this. There were so many, newly minted million and billionaires running around the city wreaking havoc. There was a guy named Lawrence Tish who I guess, controlled CBS, was a huge real estate guy and very short. And I think we referred to him as dwarf billionaire Lawrence Tish. And his lawyer once had his doctor send us a letter saying, "We need you to know that Mr. Tish is not medically a dwarf." You know?
Let's go back to this 10 years. It took you 10 years to write this book, and I was curious what it felt like as an editor to suddenly become the author of the work. And did you have an editor, and how was that? What was that relationship like?
Well, I mean, I'm still a little agog that this even happened. I mean, I'm sure, I imagine a lot of you are journalists, and I've always had colleagues, editor colleagues, who all their lives kind of secretly really wanted to be a writer. Sometimes editors are frustrated writers. I never had any interest in being a writer. I never had that wish to see my byline over the story. I always really enjoyed being a big picture person, figuring out sort of what the whole mix should be, having the idea, matching it to a writer. And I'm not really sure what came over me to decide to do this. I was an empty nester, and I just decided to do it. I had no idea how hard it was going to be. The research, of course, was really fun. I sold the book. I got the book contract without having approached Lorne Michaels. I knew him a little tiny bit because I worked for him briefly in the 80s. But after I sold the book, I went to see him in his office, and I said, "Lorne, I just sold a book about you and the show. I don't need anything from you, but if you would like to talk to me about all this, it'll be a richer book and a better book about your legacy." And anyone who's read the book knows that the most important thing about Lorne Michaels is that he hates surprises. He likes control. And so he looked like he was going to have a coronary. I mean, and tried to talk me out of it. But over the next couple of days, we talked, and he agreed to talk to me and to open his archives to me. He asked nothing in return, no control. He still says he hasn't read the book, which is fine. But I interviewed him about 50 times, and all the people in his world, and which was a delight because they're all very smart and very funny. It was pleasant time to spend. But something that just occurred to me that I thought I would mention, one of the things that was interesting talking with him and thinking about his role as a producer is, because it speaks to what you were saying about whether I'm, my identity as an editor or a writer. So Lorne lost his father suddenly when he was 14 years old. And I remember interviewing the director, Judd Apatow, once, and he also had a kind of a cataclysm happen to him when he was 14. His parents had a disastrous divorce, and they were suddenly on food stamps. And Judd described to me how that he realized that that's what made him a producer rather than a performer, because he fell into this habit of catastrophic thinking, this idea that you want to always be in control of the chaos around you. You're not brave enough to go on stage solo and do your thing. Instead, you become a clipboard guy, who's in charge of the talent and the lights and I think that that's really what happened to Lorne Michaels too, because he started out wanting to be a comedy performer, but instead he became the guy who keeps everything else organized. He's sort of the daddy figure. And, not to get too psychological, but I had a very similar kind of thing happen when I was an adolescent. My father went kind of crazy and abandoned us, and my whole world was upended. And I definitely feel that informed the part of my personality, which was about, being an editor is kind of like taking care of all of these other needy, creative people who need your help. And so it was a kind of a big, almost existential breakthrough to get to wanting to do the other thing.
Wow. And Has it changed the way you edit?
I think I'm a little bit more compassionate as an editor. Now, being on the other side of that was very interesting. I actually found it, after the initial trauma, I found it really enjoyable because, as an editor, I've always felt like, it's a very intimate process, the thing between an editor and a writer, and I've always felt that the writers that I work with, many of whom are people who I've, sort of discovered and hired when they're in their early 20s, when they're turning in a piece to me, it's like an offering. There's something very intimate about it. And I after toiling alone on this book for 10 years, because it really is lonely being a writer. Maybe that's why I didn't ever want to do it. Suddenly having another intelligence engaged in the work, really seeing you and being able to talk to you about it, that was thrilling. I thought that was really fun.
Amazing. Will you write another one?
Possibly. I don't think I would write one this big. I never really written anything. I didn't even write magazine articles. So this was, and I think when I decided to do it, it hadn't occurred to me that a biography is maybe one of the hardest kinds of things to write. About halfway into it, I realized, oh my God, this is going to have to be a sort of intellectual history of the last 60 years. It's encyclopedic. I also didn't realize, and I guess I'm going to talk about this a little bit 2 days from now when I'm going to give a master class in profile writing. I had an editor friend once who told me all biography is autobiography. So, you're writing somebody else's life, but it's your words, your lens, you're out there, you're there on the page. That for me was kind of terrifying, but I definitely feel different now. I'm really glad I did it.
Amazing. A changed person. We'd love to ask you for questions. So we have one more, I have a couple more things I'd love to talk to you about, but if you have any questions, please put your hands up or start thinking about your questions. But maybe we could go to the next slide. I wanted to talk to you about this meeting that the Pope had, the last Pope, he invited like 100 comedians. What was that about?
Well, I thought I talked to some of those comedians after they saw him. I thought that was an amazingly canny, intelligent move on the part of the Pope, because I think he had a real sense that comedy has become, just a much more important part of our general cultural baseline. I realized when I was starting to think about this book that SNL in particular, with its catchphrases, and it's almost rewired the brains of a lot of the people who watch it. People use those catchphrases in their wedding vows, and comedy is just it's the lingua franca of our time. In the New York City subways, there isn't an ad in a subway car that isn't comedy. It's something that we kind of live and breathe in a way that wasn't the case in our parents' generations. Comedy was kind of its own sort of niche. And I think that the Pope just recognized that these people really have the power to kind of penetrate the way people think, and that there is emotion and humanity in comedy. One of the things that Lorne says a lot, and this goes back to the idea that the show and political humor in general, you have to always remember that it's an entertainment. He's not trying to preach to you. And the gold standard for him, for any piece of comedy, any sketch on the show, is that you want it to be a hard laugh. And what he means by a hard laugh is, as I said before, it's like an involuntary spasm. But he says, a hard laugh is something that makes you feel like you're 8 years old. It makes you feel free, kind of frees you up. And I think the Pope knew that. I think he knows that comedy has that power to kind of connect people and to make them stop their brain racing a million miles an hour and just kind of have this moment.
Does anyone have any questions for Susan? Yes. I think we have a mic that...
Here it comes over here.
Hi, is it working? It is. I was just curious to ask you about your take about the recent developments in the relationship of Elon and Trump and the way that it's been so comically received by the public as like this huge breakup between these two men children. What do you think that does to Trump? And do you think the way that it affects him is at all connected to how he's been trying to escalate what's going on in LA? Do you think he's kind of trying to divert the attention from Elon's tweets to, what's going on in LA and trying to escalate it, make it seem like a bigger thing?
Well, I mean, this whole breakup bro meme, that we've all seen, it's just so characteristic of the Trump presidency. It's reality TV. It's the Real Housewives. It's just, and I mean, that's upsetting because the stakes are so high, but it also shows you just the enormous pettiness at play here. Frankly, with another politician, I would think that there might be a kind of distraction strategy. I don't think that Trump has the intellectual bandwidth to be strategic in that way. I mean, I don't think he's actually doing that. I think it's more of a shit show, but this thing with Musk and Trump, it's just you hope that for the average voter, perhaps even some people who did vote for him, it's just more evidence of how unstable he is.
Any other questions? I see a hand. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, welcome to Tbilisi, Georgia, and thank you for coming, and welcome to everyone. I'm a participant, it's the second year here. And actually last year, I was inspired to start thinking about writing. I have been 20 years a civic activist, and I think it would be great to hear from you because I think it becomes very obvious that people put us into certain boxes, right? So for you having a very successful career, and then deciding to become an author, how is that transformation? How can you still be, 2, 3, 5 different things at the same time? Do you put one hat at a time? How is it, and would you recommend to actually get into writing? Or it is a way harder work than it seems from in the beginning? Thank you.
Well, I would recommend people always jumping off the cliff. I mean, why not? One of the things I found as I was working on this book, and I guess it's because, so I'm in this weird position. I published my first writing project. It's literally the same month I applied for Medicare, and I survived it. But I realized as I was working on it that so many strands from different parts of my life all came together in this project. And I personally don't think I would have been capable of doing it 25 years ago. I had to be who I am and live through all the things I had lived through to be able to do it, which is probably why I didn't want to do it before. I don't think I was afraid. I really didn't have the impulse. So I think following your impulses, I mean, luckily, writing and editing are, pretty compatible. You can kind of do them in the same arena. It's not as if I decided to become a welder or something, So, yeah, I can imagine moving forward and maybe writing some stories for the magazine, possibly another book. But for now, I'm really enjoying getting back into just being able to do my day job, which is pretty demanding without this other huge deadline. at my back. But I definitely think, in terms of somebody starting writing later in life, and Shazna is writing a memoir now, or her first book, I think the more you know who you are and the more that you're confident in what you know, it's just easier. And the advice for any writer, however old you are, I think is just do it every day. You just have to keep doing it, and do it for yourself, do a Substack. It's just practice. And I didn't even realize it, but I was practicing it for 40 years, by editing and rewriting other people. I sort of just woke up and it turned out I could do this thing.
Yeah, Susan and I had a good conversation about this thing because I most of my career I was a visual journalist and an editor as well. So I wasn't, never mind writing a short story or a magazine article. Like, I embarked on an actual book, and I can't believe I wrote a book. But it was very fulfilling, and I had to change. I had to change to write this book because it's so personal. And as a journalist, I was taught not to be personal, that you sort of, there's a piece of you have to strip away when you're a journalist in certain types of journalism. And so the biggest learning for me was to learn who I am. That was a really transformational thing. And I remember my editor kept saying to me, you're not saying anything in this chapter. There's no emotion in here. You're just, it's sterile. And I was like mortified that she said my writing was sterile, but it was less about the writing. It was really more about bringing yourself to this. If you really want to do this, you've got to bring yourself to this and be very honest.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the hardest things about getting it underway was removing my editor hat, because as an editor, you don't want to move on from one paragraph to the next until it's perfect. So in the beginning, it was very slow going. I would just write it over and over again, and then I just realized, oh my God, at this rate, I will never finish. So one of my writers, Tad Friend, said, no, you're doing it all wrong. You have to do what you call the vomit draft. You have to just sit down and put everything you know down and not worry if it's terrible. Just get it all down. And I mean, in my case, that ended up with a manuscript that was twice as long as what I eventually published. But once you have it down, then you can put your editor hat back on and kind of go through and tidy it up. But yeah, it was a process. And well, I mean,
how many drafts did you have?
I guess I had the first mega vomit draft, and then I went through and tidied that up again, and then I had to do a big cut. I cut 100,000 words out of it. So I guess that's 3. So.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, I see 2 hands up. Maybe we can squeeze 2 in quickly.
Okay. I don't know how quick that is going to be. Above all, thank you very much for the presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. What I would like to ask you, because I understand that you have a very rich knowledge of the comedy field, okay, in the US. So, and you made an observation that one concern for you about comedies is that they have grown very bipartisan. Now,
I couldn't, there's a bit of distortion.
Okay, so like comedies are very bipartisan. So, okay, that was your point. Now, I would reword it differently. This means, from the perspective of the genre itself, that actually they are using the same technologies, the same ways of doing the comedy, except the target is the other one, which is likely to bipolarize the constituency further. So what I would like to ask you, if you see any changes to the way comedy itself is being done in a way that indirectly, not explicitly like through reasoning, but indirectly inculcates the audience into a different way of laughing. Because if it is made into pure entertainment, I would say it always keeps you at a bay giving you the impression that you are all outside of it, whereas we are all involved in it. So other than just having a good laugh that gives us the breathing space, is there any changes that would engage the laughing audience in some kind of pro-action, like to laughing for something?
Well, I think what I would say is, one of the things that we've all seen in the media lately is just how siloed, people watch Fox News, people read the New York Times. There's very little that reaches, Lorne Michaels likes to say, we're on in all 50 states. That's a virtue. All different kinds of people watch the show. People who elected Trump watch the show. People who voted, for Kamala watch the show. And I think that if the comedy, if you don't know exactly where it's coming from, I mean, Dave Chappelle is a good example. He's a comedian who's hosted the show a few times. His monologues often go into places that liberals find uncomfortable, comedy about trans people, things like that. And I think that if you're going to be surprised, I mean, if someone is going to kind of veer off the partisan script, it's going to make people really listen. That's what I think is the best thing. You don't want just right down the middle progressive jokes. You don't want just jokes on Fox News. You want something that is going to make you have to listen and consider and think. And I think that's really the root of their professed nonpartisan approach, just to give people the potential to be surprised with what their own reaction is. I don't know if I've answered your question. I hope I have.
I think we're at time, unfortunately, but Susan's around, so if you see her and you still have a burning question, you can snag her.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's really
Thank
fun.
you, Susan.